I know you guys are former teammates and you guys are now competitors against each other, but what do you think makes him good?
His biggest thing is steroids. You can't gain 50 pounds of muscle and be like, oh, it's irrelevant. No, it's super fucking relevant. You wouldn't be half the person you were if you didn't do that. No disrespect, but like you have somebody that preaches, oh, technique is king, and then why you're trying to be so strong. I honestly wouldn't have even said that if he didn't, after our match, be like, oh, this guy's fucking greasing, which I didn't. First of all, no, never cheated a fucking bit. On top of that, I'm a natural athlete going against an enhanced athlete, and you still need excuses. I definitely wouldn't have even called him out on that, but it just irked me a little bit that he's like, oh, this guy's fucking greasing. Yeah. It's like, I broke your foot, just fucking live with it.
After seeing this post from Nicky Rodriguez, Gordon decided to make a ton of posts back. There was a lot of shit talk, and then obviously the buildup of drama. On one of Gordon's posts, Derek commented, Merrick Health will cover an impromptu blood test, Nicky Rod, if you're in. Show up tomorrow morning to a LabCorp with proof that it was you who had their blood drawn, and I'll take a look and see if it looks natural.
What's up, guys? Derek, moreplates.com. Today we are talking about Nicky Rod's blood test results. They are in, and there's some interesting stuff in it. So Gordon Ryan is seen as one of the best, if not the best, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete on the planet. And he has a pretty intense rivalry with a former teammate, Nicky Rod, who is also a very, very high up there BJJ athlete. And they have this feud going essentially, and it kind of stemmed from Gordon accusing him of greasing, and then Nicky Rod basically saying Gordon has a huge advantage because he takes a bunch of steroids. And then it kind of begs the question, how is Nicky Rod natural when he is competing against a bunch of guys who are on gear? Because BJJ is one of the most steroid-ridden sports there is. And he claims natty and Gordon calls bullshit. So it's led to this scenario where we kind of have like a natty or not debacle. And basically, Gordon's going back and forth with him in Instagram posts. And it leads to this. He basically says, you know, how do you explain going from this to this in a short period of time? Here he mentions how can you explain to the fans, please, and how in one photo you look like a fat dad who used to play his high school football, yet now has a left titty. And in the other photo, looks like Arnold getting ready for the Olympia. So obviously a pretty dramatic difference in physique here. Leads to a whole, shitstorm of comments and people debating about it. More back and forth. And then eventually he, calls him out for even saying like how, Nicky Rod basically says the guy has a huge advantage because he takes drugs, whereas he doesn't. He's natural. He's competing against guys who take drugs. So Gordon makes another post, and in the comment section, I'm like, you know what? Let's see if this guy, if you're getting called out on the spot, it's pretty difficult to plan your way around this. So on Impromptu, I've never talked to Nicky Rod in my life, and I see this situation unfolding. I decide to pop in there and I say, Merrick Health will cover an impromptu blood test. Nicky Rod, if you're in, show up tomorrow morning to a LabCorp with proof that it was you who had their blood drawn, and I'll take it and see if it looks natural. So again, this was, on February 14th, and within a few hours, I get a response from Nicky Rod saying, let's do it. So literally never talked to the guy in my life, and he takes me up on it. Again, not a WADA accredited lab or anything of this nature. However, short of a bulletproof, full-blown drug test, this is the best you're going to do with a guy who is being called out on the spot within a couple hours. So again, like obviously you could go the more bulletproof route like a Matt Does Fitness, where we actually coordinated like long-term longitudinal analysis through WADA accredited labs and testing with concurrent urine and blood analysis with the entire steroidal module, biological passport with hematology checked, as well as the presence of every synthetic drug under the sun essentially. But with this, on a moment's notice, I figured, hey, let's see if this guy is on gear right now and we can at least see it through his blood work. If the guy is shut down or suppressed or has any relics or kind of, telltale signs of residual hormone use, which would be in your blood for a fairly significant period of time if you're getting called out, unless you just happen to be a guy who is never drug tested in a sport that everyone uses whatever the fuck they want essentially, and you happen to be one of the only ones who like fully cycles off and lets it all clear out of your system, and you have no residual impact to your blood work whatsoever before getting back on a cycle. Like, it seems quite unlikely that a guy who is on gear would not be cruising at minimum after, you know, coming off, even if they were blasting at one point preparing for a event. So with him, I'm like, yeah, like this is, even if it's within, I believe he competed against Gordon like a couple months prior or something, even if it was within a, you know, close time frame, like we would see a residual impact on his blood work on a moment's notice. Like it's not this guy, it's not like he could have planned around it and been like, oh, I'm gonna use fucking test suspension and be on short ester drugs or do this or do that. Like there was no planning. It was literally like, hey, if you want, go here the next morning and get your blood drawn, yes or no, and I'm paying for it. That was like the literally first interaction I've ever had with the guy. And he said yes. So kudos to him for that, regardless of the result. So this led to me then having to get somebody to go on my behalf to make sure he doesn't cheat and like get somebody else to draw blood on his behalf or something. So that leads to this video by Zach Tellender, who then goes with him in Texas to make sure it's him who draws his blood and doesn't finagle his way around the process. Boom! AG1 by Athletic Greens is sponsoring today's video. This is the go-to green supplement that I have been using myself for a minute now, and it is packed with a bunch of different stuff. It's not just greens. It is 75 vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens in one convenient daily serving. It is designed to be kind of like an all-in-one kind of product. It's gone over 52 iterations in the past decade, which is something that I very much appreciate, is them staying on top of the literature to continuously update it to make sure it is the most on the cutting edge of products, because a lot of these bigger companies will actually just lean on their existing formula produced in mass for economies of scale and leave the formula exactly the same for years on end, even if there's new literature that's come out to then contradict some of the ingredients that they've featured previously. So they're constantly updating this thing, which is very reassuring to me, and the reason I've deferred to it as my greens formula to go to, and I even let them be a sponsor of the channel, is because of all of the credible names that have gotten behind this product that I trust myself for my own education and whatnot as well. And the main thing for me, why I use it, is it's convenient. You know, I spend hours grocery shopping, salad creations, eating them, and cleaning. And to be honest, for me, if I can get a fraction of the benefits or a significant fraction of the benefits with a quick, just toss it in a shaker or a cup, swig it and you're done, like that amount of time efficiency is so worth it for me. So that is the main reason why I use a supplement. Again, it's a supplement, not a replacement for food. It is a supplement to your current diet if warranted for your own contextual situation. So if you fall into a similar boat to me, could be worthwhile. So if you want to check it out, the link in the description below will get you also a free year supply of D3 and K2. In addition to that, 5 free travel packs for on the go. The travel packs are really, really convenient. And you can get that with your first purchase using the link below, athleticgreens.com/moreplates, and much appreciate when you guys support me via the companies that support me. And back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, good morning. It's Wednesday, February 15th at 8:56 a.m. I got an interesting text message from Derek from More Plates, More Dates. So he was like, hey, you know who Nicky Rod is? Nicky Rod is somewhat of a famous jiu-jitsu player. So he's really good, super heavyweight. And then he said he's a rival of Gordon Ryan, and he's getting a Merrick Health impromptu blood test tomorrow in Austin, Texas. Would you be free and willing to go there to make sure he gets his blood drawn and doesn't have someone else swap it? But here's basically what's happened. Nicky Rodriguez and Gordon Ryan, probably the most famous jiu-jitsu athlete and probably one of the best jiu-jitsu athletes of all time. He and Nicky Rodriguez were competing on the same team under John Danaher. They went under the Danaher Death Squad. They split up and went to 2 different gyms, but they were both in Austin. And from what I've heard, that split wasn't amicable. There hasn't really been that much talk between the two of them, other than like maybe the competitive rival type of talk, none of the personal stuff. Until recently, when Nicky Rodriguez was on Mark Bell's Powercast, Mark Bell and Nsima being friends of mine, I know that podcast really well. Nsima posted a clip on his Instagram of Nicky Rodriguez basically saying that it's a really understated thing that Gordon Ryan does steroids, and he put on 50 pounds of muscle. He talks a lot about technique, but in reality, it's his strength that made a massive difference. And the only reason why Nicky even brought this up and was angry was because Gordon said that he was quote unquote greasing before their match. Greasing is basically you can put like lotion, you can put baby oil on before a jiu-jitsu match. It makes you slipperier. It makes it harder for someone to grab onto you and submit you. Now, after seeing this post from Nicky Rodriguez, Gordon decided to make a ton of posts back. There was a lot of talk and then obviously the buildup of drama. On one of Gordon's posts, Derek commented, "Merrick Health will cover an impromptu blood test, Nicky Rod, if you're in. Show up tomorrow morning to a LabCorp with proof that it was you who had their blood drawn, and I'll take a look and see if it looks natural." So this was around 2 p.m. yesterday. Then about 2 hours later, Nicky contacted Derek, got into his DMs, and then they set up the LabCorp testing, which was this morning at 9:30.
Okay, so after that, Zach accompanies him to LabCorp and basically sits in on him getting his blood drawn. You know, there's a funny back and forth between the lab, the guy taking his blood, and Nick basically saying, you know, why are you getting all this shit done? He basically says to prove to somebody I'm not taking steroids. Pretty entertaining video. Go check it out on Zach's channel. But this is the clip that basically stemmed, triggered all of this stuff to begin with.
I know you guys are former teammates and you guys are now competitors against each other, but what do you think makes him good?
His biggest thing is steroids. You can't gain 50 pounds of muscle and be like, oh, it's irrelevant. No, it's super fucking relevant. You wouldn't be half the person you were if you didn't do that. No disrespect, but like you have somebody that preaches, oh, technique is king, and then why you're trying to be so strong. I honestly wouldn't have even said that if he didn't, after our match, be like, oh, this guy's fucking greasing, which I didn't. First of all, no, never cheated a fucking bit. On top of that, I'm a natural athlete going against an enhanced athlete, and you still need excuses. I definitely wouldn't have even called him out on that, but it just irked me a little bit that he's like, oh, this guy's fucking greasing.
Yeah.
It's like, I broke your foot, just fucking live with it.
Pretty hectic, bro. So here we are, and we finally got the test results, and to be clear, there is a lot of talk about this guy's physique. Does it look, way different than it used to? He posted this before and after himself from the actual, a previous event. I think this was ADCC. This is actually the original transformation. 17 years old to 26, gaining 50 pounds, bro, lean. And the physique that he has thrown up as a comparison this is in front of the LabCorp, literally getting his random blood draw. And this is him at ADCC. So obviously he's gonna be more pumped, more vascular, more everything when you are under sick lighting and have just competed versus cold standing outside in natural lighting. So I think he did himself a disservice in this photo, to be honest. But some of the shots he's taken are actually pretty, decent. Like this is a shot from his story. And when you see him like in ideal circumstances, he doesn't look dramatically different from his, after shots that you see as like, him preparing for the Olympia supposedly. So I don't think that there's like a massive difference. Perhaps he weighs a little bit more at ADCC. It's entirely possible that he was on something at the time, but let's at least get into the blood work and kind of flesh out what we actually found. All right, so here we are. We have Nicholas Rodriguez, age 26. He did this test fasting, which is notable for some of the results we get into later. So first off, we have thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is the hormone that basically is the regulating feedback loop stimulating hormone that determines how much thyroid output you're gonna have. So again, when you have a lot of your hormone systems in the body works through feedback systems. So when you have an adequate amount of free circulating T4 and then subsequent to that T3, you are going to have a certain feedback system in place whereby your body is not going to need to stimulate as much hormone output, TSH, because you have an adequate amount of thyroid hormone circulating in your body to facilitate physiologic functions. So when we see a TSH that's high, it is kind of a red flag in that somebody may have hypothyroidism. So that is where you would then look to symptoms of hypothyroidism, like body temperature during waking and average midday. You would look at, is your hair falling out randomly? You have telogen effluvium for seemingly no reason. You have lethargy. Like there are a bunch of different symptoms associated with hypothyroidism, but this is kind of a interesting thing to note because it's clearly at a range, and this is even among like the relatively broad reference interval that LabCorp has, I would say a more ideal TSH would be closer to like 1 to 2 or less, which would indicate that basically he is working a lot harder to produce the thyroid hormones that he has than perhaps he should otherwise be, which could be a red flag for potential higher propensity to things like, I think goiter and thyroid cancer would be on my radar for sure. So notably, his T4 free as a result of this, stimulating amount of stimulation is good. Like his T4 free looks solid, and ultimately I would be looking at symptoms. And again, this would be all through a doctor, of course. This is just my cursory overview. You would use a company like a Merrick Health, shameless plug, which is what we use for this blood test, in order to have this assessed by a medical professional. So anyways, just from my cursory glance as a non-medical professional, I see T4 free and it looks solid to me, but this is all pending, certain metabolic kind of like proxies. Like I would be looking, again, like I mentioned, body temperature, but even like heart rate too. Like there are certain things you could be looking at that would indicate thyroid function that are worthwhile. So that is, again, when it comes to gear, anabolics, and anything of that nature, a high TSH like this is something I would, like, he's not on thyroid hormone. I can guarantee that, because he would otherwise have a low TSH if he was abusing that. Not that that would be significantly performance enhancing anyways. You could look into things like growth hormone interactions, but ultimately this TSH is so high and things are down later in the blood work we'll get into. I feel like, to me, this is more of like a health marker that is a red flag than anything, more than a PED related proxy. So we'll get into the actual anabolic androgenic steroid stuff later. So as we scroll down, we have a CBC with differential and platelet. So this is going to be your complete blood count, where we can assess your red blood cell count, hemoglobin, your oxygen carrying capacity, how thick, sludgy, and viscous your blood could potentially be. And in general, when you have a biological passport that is assessing your hematology metrics over time, this is something that would be used to catch people using erythropoietin or other hematology modulating drugs in order to enhance oxygen carrying capacity during like a BJJ match, being able to use EPO or something. Hugely fucking performance enhancing, as you would think. So here, again, this is just a snapshot in time. It's not like we have longitudinal data to actually assess, oh, is this guy using fill in the blank? But what we can tell is nothing is out of range at least. You would not be, at least at a baseline level, would not be triggering like a abnormal finding and like digging into it further. With that said, obviously urine would be great to see an EPO in there, but this is more so, again, I mentioned at the beginning, the preface of all this is a physique related thing more so than anything. And if this guy took gear to reach his 50 pounds of lean mass accrued, that has nothing to do with EPO and performance enhancement in sport. So ideally, under more rigorous circumstances, we would have the entire WADA banned substance list that we would be testing for through urine, including carbon isotope ratio testing, EPO analysis, and blood work analysis with HGH isoform differential immunoassay and all these different high analytical tests. But with the blood work being super unprompted, this guy thinking he's never going to be drug tested fucking ever, like this is at a baseline level, like reasonably indicative of at least what was going on for the several months prior, which you can then extrapolate out certain potential conclusions. You can't conclude anything for lifelong, but it is still insightful nonetheless. So I just keep wanting to give that preface here. This blood test is not a way to actually define for sure if somebody's natural or not, even at the current standing in time, but it is pretty fucking insightful given the context of how random this really was. And given the fact that he's competed not that long ago and his physique really doesn't look that much different when you look at his lean mass, body composition and whatnot. So anyways, getting further into it, we have a glucose level fasted, which is high, 109. So this is actually kind of concerning. So if he in fact is fasting, and it's not just marked down on that, like he was instructed to be fasted and he went in right in the morning. This is kind of a concerning number that makes me kind of wonder, okay, this is like pre-diabetic level glucose territory for a fasting number. Definitely a red flag. Does it have anything to do with anabolics though? No, it would be more so, okay, growth hormone deployment could potentially elevate your glucose levels, but how helpful will growth hormone really be to his body composition at the end of the day to achieve that 50 pound of mass gain if he was only on growth hormone and nothing else, which is a actual reasonable PED to be using, especially in BJJ when injuries are, injury proofing yourself would be at the highest of priorities. This is something that is not going to be responsible for the 50 pounds of lean mass accrued. We can see actual clinical studies using upwards of 20 units of pharma grade GH and having essentially no significant muscle growth outcomes whatsoever. It's kind of the effect it has in conjunction with exogenous androgens and hypertrophy training and insulin and other things that make it kind of like a 1 + 1 + 1 = fucking 10 kind of thing in a bodybuilding scenario. But in a BJJ scenario and him gaining from 180 to 230 is, if he was just on GH, would that have done it? No, it wouldn't have. So it might have helped a little bit, but I mean, it is not, at the end of the day, this is an anabolic androgenic steroid analysis essentially is what we want to hear. So anyways, I'm not ruling out GH, but we'll get into that later. Lipid panel. All right, so this is where things get kind of awry. So we have a high total cholesterol, really fucking high, 263. That's concurrently with what is a LDL-C of 190. So this guy is in familial hypercholesterolemia territory. So it kind of begs the question at this point, I'm wondering, okay, what is your diet to have yielded a 109 fasting glucose, a 263 total cholesterol, and again, notably, 53 HDL is not going to be typical among guys who are blasting gear. You are going to be hard pressed to find a guy who uses a shit ton of anabolics who is above 40. A guy on TRT, maybe you're 50, 60 at best. Typically, it's actually very atypical to get that. Like even myself at a very conservative dosage of TRT, I am hard pressed to get myself over 50. And I have like pretty fucking good blood work, I would say. So again, everyone has different metabolism of cholesterol and different things though. So for him, a 53 is certainly in his favor more for looking natural than a guy who's blasting. Again, like I said, I can almost guarantee anybody who's blasting androgens right now is going to be like, I've seen as low as like really, you would be shocked, dude. Like the difference between a natural and a guy blasting an HDL is going to be like, literally like 60 points sometimes, if not more. All right. That could be extreme too, by the way. I'm just, saying in worse circumstances. All right, so LDL-C of 190. So this is kind of where you start to look at either what kind of diet are you following, or do you have like genetic predispositions that are problematic that you may then justify something like a PCSK9 inhibitor like a Repatha, because this is like a really high number, frankly. And this is like atherogenic territory. So for a guy at 26, like I'm sure he has a, flawless coronary artery calcium score if he was to get it done. But this is like the beginnings from what I could see. Actually, frankly, if he's had this for a while, he's probably been building up some plaque since teenagehood, realistically, if not younger. So this is something I would be super fucking aware of. Basically, there are different lipoproteins that encase these fatty compositions. Essentially, you have actual cholesterol within these lipoproteins to then transport them throughout the body because they are not hydrophilic. They are lipophilic, meaning they are not going to transport well in serum. Like they are going to be repellent of water, serum, blood. They are things that need to be encased in this lipoprotein to then be transported around the body. Basically, the point is that fat doesn't go well with water type substances, and you need something to hold it to then like transport it around. And the lower density lipoproteins can essentially be more atherogenic, meaning they are going to be more prone to causing atherosclerosis, plaque buildup in the arterial wall. So we get further into this and we see some interesting effects on his iron metabolism too. So basically here, this is a representation of unsaturated sites on transferrin. So almost think of transferrin like I don't know if it would be fair to say it's like the binding protein equivalent of SHBG for iron, which is something that would otherwise bind up iron and actually transport it around the body. However, when you have a UIBC, it's basically assessing unsaturated binding capacity of iron for transferrin sites. So it's like if you have less of those available, this number can become low, indicating a reflection of iron overload. So that is why he has what appears to be a borderline, literally iron overload via serum, but also an iron saturation of 62%. So he not only has a limited amount of sites to actually transport it around for iron metabolism and just, transportation in different target tissues. But in addition to that, there was just a significantly higher amount than should be present of iron itself, which is kind of this constellation of what seems to be, when we get further in the blood work, a little bit of metabolic syndrome, which corresponds with his pre-diabetic blood glucose level and some of these cholesterol metrics, which we'll get into shortly. But it's kind of interesting because he's a really fucking healthy looking guy and he has really healthy activities seemingly. So it makes me wonder, like, what is this guy's diet at the end of the day? And what is he using supplement wise or not supplement wise? Or what's his sleep hygiene like? Does he have sleep apnea that's undiagnosed? Like, a lot of questions arise from this because he is otherwise, and especially if he's natural, like, this is like, how is a guy who is so jacked and you would think like insulin sensitive as hell and just like dialed in through all of his activity and such, like looking like this on his blood work? Like, this is reflective of a guy who is going to be very prone to cardiovascular disease potentially. So keeping going, testosterone free and total through equilibrium ultrafiltration, as well as a liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry. This might be an equilibrium dialysis actually, but either way it's accurate and is a higher sensitivity method of testing. So here we have an 843 nanogram per deciliter total test level, which is the number we all wanted to see. That's pretty good, top end of normal. The question is he maintaining that exogenously with a little fucking needle in his ass, bro? That's what we want to know. So we have a testosterone free of 17.37 nanograms per deciliter with a 2.06% free test ratio between the two. So again, if we have a guy who's on gear, typically we're going to see a downward pressure on SHBG at the liver. This is something that is going to be pretty widespread across androgen users, and it's kind of one of the most telltale signs aside from gonadotropins is look at their SHBG, and it's typically going to be like sub 20 for a guy who's blasting. I have seen single digit SHBGs commonplace across guys who are using gear, even guys who are like pushing their TRT. This is something that in general, you're going to have a disproportionately high free test if you are somebody who's on gear or has otherwise been subject to gear and is otherwise like coming off of it. Like, this is something that is often going to be disproportionate and way higher than 2 to 3%. So a guy who is at 2.06, like, this is the bottom of an optimal range in my opinion for ratio wise. So this indicates, and what we'll see later, I haven't even scrolled down, but I already know his SHBG is natural looking just based on this ratio, which is interesting because are you going to have a 50 plus SHBG if you're a guy who's on androgens or has recently come off of androgens? Probably not. And would your gonadotropins be simultaneously high? No, those would be low, and you'd see some residual impact and relics in your blood work of something that corresponds to gear use, which we'll get to shortly. And again, you would also see better management of glucose. You would see better glucose metabolism through heightened anabolic androgenic steroid exposure, given that is going to increase your muscle tissue and increase your ability to actually utilize nutrients and not be subject to, like, it's kind of wild because this guy has a crazy physique for what may be natural, but he also has like pre-diabetic biomarkers. So this number here, hemoglobin A1C at 5.7, this is a measurement of how much glycosylated hemoglobin there is. So how much glucose is stuck to red blood cells in the serum. And through this, you can actually use it as a proxy for a certain amount of time. How long has there been a certain amount of glucose in the blood? Because red blood cells have a certain lifespan, and the more glucose that has then, bound itself up, the more glucose you can essentially determine has been in the bloodstream this entire time for the lifespan of that red blood cell. So here we have a 5.7%, which is the threshold for pre-diabetes territory. Now, in unison on its own, this marker is not like the end all be all. It certainly shouldn't be indicative of, like, it is a metric that is important nonetheless, but it should be the constellation of factors and different biomarkers that give you a more informed assessment of things. Like a fasting insulin is going to be very worthwhile to assessing insulin resistance as well, which we'll get to shortly. DHEA sulfate looks good, 263. This is like an adrenal hormone, well, the sulfated form of an adrenal hormone that is otherwise not really suppressed when you take gear though. So it's not very indicative, even though this is an androgen in itself. Here we go, cortisol output. So in the morning, looks normal to me. Here we go, luteinizing hormone, what everyone here came to see, 8.8 on a reference interval of 1.7 to 8.6. So this guy is literally super physiologic signaling to his testes right now to produce testosterone. So you might say, oh, like, well, Does that mean gear or does that not mean gear? These numbers for somebody who is exposing themselves to anabolic steroids would be in the toilet, because if you were using exogenous testosterone or exogenous androgens at all, you are going to, and even if it was like a negligible amount, like he was using some little bit of Anavar or whatever and something that might otherwise not crash you into nothingness, you would be suppressed quite significantly to a point that we would see apparent red flags. Having an LH on the high end is indicative of high pituitary output towards the testes to produce intratesticular testosterone. So if I was taking testosterone, which I do, then that would be then signaling to your brain, like, we have enough testosterone and estrogen in the body, so you don't need to make as much testosterone. So therefore, gonadotropin releasing hormone goes down. Subsequent to that, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone can go down because we don't need as much signal to the testes to produce testosterone because we have a sufficient amount of androgens and estrogen in the body. So for here, seeing an LH of 8.8, it essentially rules out the usage of any anabolics within a reasonable time frame. So if he was in fact using something to, I believe he competed against Gordon 8 weeks ago or something, or 10 weeks ago. Well, at the time of this blood work, it was like a couple months before it. Could be wrong on that. I believe Gordon mentioned, he was like, how convenient, you got a blood test while looking like a soft bag of shit compared to your usual form. 5 months after ADCC, when everyone is known to cycle off with no matches currently announced, since you're so on board with drug testing, would you be willing to take a random USADA WADA testing from now until next ADCC? I will be more than happy to fund them so it doesn't cost you a dime. You don't have anyway. Since you're the only one claiming to be the natty king, this shouldn't be an issue, right? Simple yes or no question. If yes, let's see how that body looks in 2 years. If no, then you just expose yourself again, waiting for a response. And then Nicky Rod says, okay, I'll do it. For every USADA test I pass, you pay me 10K. If I fail any, I'll pay you back. And then he goes on to respond saying, Nicky Fraud thinks I'm as dumb as he is. Do you really get censored if you say dumb? He wants me to pay 10K per test so he can, one of two things, either make sure he gets paid more for showing up natty and losing than he would showing up on cycle and winning. Okay, first place is 10K, or he would just not compete until ADCC stay natural and then fake an injury and not compete but still get the money. So this is a good out, but literally everyone reading this is smarter than that. Nonetheless, he agreed. So a contract will be drawn up shortly so he can start these random testing. Good luck. So again, like, as much as this is insightful into the current state of things, it does not bulletproof the result. It does not, rule out previous use in years past, but it does reasonably rule out like a significant period of time previous, and the fact that there was no attempt to circumvent it or get around it in any capacity whatsoever, or wait for it, or set up any sort of finagling that I could perceive. It was pretty telling that the guy had the balls to go show up and wasn't worried whatsoever, because a guy who has been using gear, regardless of how well you think you know the ins and outs of this shit, like if you have relatively recently used shit, you might be thinking, is there a relic of this in my blood work that could otherwise be seen? Because again, WADA is not going to do all these tests. They are not going to check your gonadotropins. They are not going to test threshold levels of fill in the blank biomarker. They are going to be looking simply for aberrations in your red blood cell count, hemoglobin, hematocrit, your CBC in general, to assess, okay, does this guy blood dope or does he use EPO? Potentially. And then this is just a red flag to subsequently then further test you for EPO. We're not even going to test that off the bat because it's too expensive. That's typically what most organizations will do. And then also from a steroidal module aspect, it is just urinary metabolites and ratios of them to assess if this guy falls within some cutoff for, well, he might be using testosterone at this point. So then after that, as a red flag, we're going to then carbon isotope ratio test him after that. There is no assessment of total test levels, free tests, SHBG, suppression metrics. IGF-1 isn't even looked at, even though it should be. And in some cases it has been. It's looking to be adopted as a more permanent biomarker for GH deployment, but that's neither here nor there, another discussion. But at the end of the day, like, this is pretty insightful metrics for a guy who on a whim just showed up. FSH also in range on the lower end of the reference range, but ultimately LH is what is going to dictate testosterone output in the testes. So that begs the question then, some people are going to be like, oh, did he use an HCG then to get around it? No, I tested for that. He used no HCG. It was not detectable. Now, again, he could have potentially used an HCG prior and had it out of his system by the time, but that would be a pretty ballsy thing to do, is to show up for a test, getting HCG tested, knowing that you took HCG relatively recently, which has a decently long half-life. It's not that quick in any of your system. And even if he didn't, that would be suppressive of LH. A lot of people, for some reason, think HCG cranks up LH output. No, it would in fact act as an LH mimic, meaning it would still have the same negative feedback to your HPTA, then telling you to produce less LH. So you would have a lower LH level as a result of an HCG administration. So that would be ruled out. So you would then have to be arguing that this guy is on like some aggressive dose of Clomid or something with his gear in order to then achieve these numbers while concurrently being on the gear, or just using a Clomid in post cycle, or just being luckily off cycle for enough period of time after ADCC to have been randomly tested and just been like, whoa, like this is fortuitous timing that Derek is asking now, because I just happen to be cleanly off for like 3+ months, totally natty. I don't even cruise. I just blast just for the events, and then I come off entirely. Like anyone who is serious about taking gear and is competing at a high level and is not being tested whatsoever would not be cycling off entirely. Like you would be going down to a baseline threshold amount of something that is sustainable, so you're not fluctuating in and out, crushing your HPTA constantly, and then having to recover and then jump back on gear again. It wouldn't really make sense. So again, if he was being subject to testing though, bit of a different story, but that appears to not be the case as of recent. So if he's not being tested, not subject to testing, why the fuck would you cycle off to begin with? So IGF-1, notably 240, high end of the reference range, but not really in doping territory for a guy who would be blasting shit, and it does not really seem to be suppressed significantly through a use of a SERM necessarily. It looks natural. Now again, we can't really discern for certain that he doesn't have residual Clomid that is suppressing his IGF-1, and the IGF-1 is still getting held up at the top of the reference range from an HGH. But what we can tell is there's no androgens being used for a reasonable period of time, almost certainly. Vitamin D on the low end of normal. This would be worthwhile looking at. Vitamin D supplementation would be warranted, in my opinion, in this scenario, or getting way more sunlight or something. So, and then here we get more into the health markers, a lipoprotein little a of 100. This is a genetic risk factor, independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, essentially. So for him, now that we've seen lipoprotein little a, and if you go further down, he has a 695 ferritin and an apolipoprotein B of 142. Like this guy is in heavy duty plaque buildup territory, and also metabolic syndrome territory, and actually needs to look at this shit from a health perspective. Like this very, very odd, and not like, it's not odd, but it's kind of, you would expect the guy who is like realistically like a physical manifestation of like health and fitness, if he's natural, if he's a BJJ athlete, like at one of the guys at the top of the sport, looks fucking sick. Like you would think that all these markers would be dialed. But I suspect there is either significant diet modifications that may be needed, or sleep hygiene interventions, or has a very, very significant genetic predisposition, which should be addressed accordingly through either lifestyle changes, dietary manipulations, or pharmacology. So this is actually, if he wasn't, I don't know if he gets blood work regularly or not, but this to me is indicative of like actually warranted further follow-up for the lipid markers as well as the metabolic markers, because again, like this was good, at least like a 6.7 insulin. I was expecting like this could be worse, but it could also be much better for a guy who is showing up with a high fasting glucose in pre-diabetic territory. You are then producing more insulin to then keep your glucose down, which obviously isn't adequately being done because of the high hemoglobin A1C. So indirectly down the line, he is probably going to be burning out beta cells and basically putting more stress on his pancreas than he otherwise would need to if he didn't have these high glucose levels and was actually insulin sensitive enough to actually assimilate everything. Well, and for him, to me, this is indicative of like progressing insulin resistance, progressing heightened stress on his pancreas, progressing potentially type 2 diabetes, as well as, you know, these lipid markers that are going to be problematic for cardiovascular disease outcomes. So again, circling back to the androgens, his gonadotropins look good to me. They look very natural. His SHBG, even if you were coming off within this is a pretty hard number to get where you want it as a androgen user, frankly. So his physique would have to, like, from now, if he's gonna be subject to WADA testing, it would have to melt from now until ADCC for him to actually have not been natural, in my opinion. So this is something that, I don't know, like, I guess that's up to the determination, subjective opinion of if this guy's physique looks way worse now than in past. Like, to me, it seems like a lot of this is like a lighting thing, a pump thing, because he, like, to me, if this is peak Arnold physique, for example, or like Gordon says, like, looks like Arnold here, like, he looks pretty fucking sick here, dude. And I'm sure if he got a pump and was under good downlighting, he would look similar like on a quite frequent basis. Now I could be wrong. That's just my interpretation of the situation. Like this looks pretty fucking solid, dude. And I think that, you know, it's to be determined. I'm not saying that he's definitively natural. I'm just saying my interpretation of it is it does not seem like there's like a dramatic fluctuation, with exception of this, of course, which is suspect nonetheless. But I have also seen a lot of guys who are really cranked looking just get super out of shape and fat, and it looks like they don't lift anymore, when in reality they're still jacked once they get shredded. Now, what circumstances led to this, what context was behind this picture? He's obviously outside without a pump and shit lighting. That doesn't help, but he's also much fatter for sure. Like there's no doubt about it. I don't know for sure what led to that. I could be wrong. He could have been, and I'm not saying he's lifelong natural by any means. So again, like this, the difference between this and this could be just like shit lifestyle versus not, or it could certainly be like something to do with anabolics. But what we can say for near certain is that within a reasonable time frame, the guy's not used shit, and he certainly has a good case to be made for that if he continues to subject himself to drug testing until, you know, the biggest event of his life. If he does not fluctuate dramatically in like strength, body composition outcomes, whatever, you know, like I would say there's like a certainly pretty good chance that the guy's been natural for a while, if not years. Like it's pretty night and day when you see guys who have no holds barred access to using gear to compete at a high level, and then what happens to their physique thereafter if they pulled it out entirely. Like there's a dramatic difference. It's not like a iffy, you know, maybe he was, maybe he's not. Like I think I see a difference. I think I don't under this lighting. Like it's a fucking clear as day. Like you were on gear, you're not in general, if you're going like balls out versus like totally natty. So I don't know. It's to be determined. I do think that he is natural now. I also do think that he is probably natural within a reasonable time frame previously. And it looks like by the dates he competed against Gordon in December, which was about, about 2 months prior to getting this blood test. So what is the probability he would have not been on gear when he's competing against Gordon, but then at ADCC he was on gear? Like I would say low for sure. With that said, does 8 weeks give you enough time to clear stuff out of your system to have a clean blood test? Absolutely, for sure it does. But my understanding is that, like, why would you have been cleaning out? Like, would you have assumed that somebody was just going to randomly be like, hey, go to a lab tomorrow and get your fucking blood drawn? I imagine that was not going through his head. So I can only assume, you know, logical conclusion that he probably, and again, I see no relics of androgen use in his blood whatsoever. I would imagine he was probably natural during the competition with Gordon in December. And that's to be determined about if he was at ADCC or previous to that or not, or at all. Because again, this could be certainly off. There's certain manipulations that could be done if you were a fucking, you know, if he was like actually considering that he might get called out and started to push harder on the, you know, I'm natty angle, thinking that he'd get, you know, challenged on it in order to prove himself. And he just like really fucking strategically thought this out and just was hedging on the opportunity to potentially get randomly tested, even though he's never been before. I don't know. It's tough to say, but I would say that at this time he is natty and he has been for a decent period of time. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And Nicky Rod, I would definitely recommend you get follow-ups on this blood work, because these lipid markers and the metabolic markers are actually concerning. So definitely, hopefully a blessing in disguise, both for, I don't know, him on his natural status potentially, and also him figuring out how to dial in his health. So thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplacemordates.com. Follow me on Instagram, @moreplacemordates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, Apple Podcasts. If you want to support the channel, you can check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below, including Merrick Health, if you want to get your own deep dive blood test and elaborate diagnostic metrics. This is something we go above and beyond at via Merrick Health. This is something that you will not get these insightful of biomarkers and analysis of them really anywhere else. We have medical providers that are at the cutting edge of this stuff and really stay on top of the literature to know what you should be looking at, how to actually dial in and diagnose abnormalities, imbalances, imperfections, even like how to really get things optimized, and assessing further stratified blood and biomarkers that are simply not going to be looked at by your general family physician or something like that. Like most have no idea the impact that some of these different lipoprotein formats even have in terms of atherosclerosis potential. It's always just like, here's your LDL and your HDL, your good and bad, and here's your triglyceride and your total cholesterol. And that is like the furthest they'll often go. And then further to that, assessing insulin resistance before you're full-blown diabetic, or assessing abnormalities in gonadotropin output if you're on the precipice of low T in constellation with all these other things. Like, it is absolutely worthwhile to get a baseline panel, even if you're a natural, even if you're a guy in your early 20s or even your late teens. Like, to me, this is something that, like, at the, like, right on the threshold of like full-blown adulthood, where you have your most dialed in consistent routine, I think it is absolutely worthwhile for everybody to get a baseline panel assessed. So then you have a benchmark. So if something goes awry, you can then backtrack and see accordingly what went wrong and kind of dial into why and figure out how to optimize yourself moving forward. Or for guys who haven't got any blood work, like, I feel like there's almost no circumstance in when blood work is not a worthwhile thing to have a elaborate snapshot in time of your health status at least once, and then you can dial in from there accordingly. And some of this stuff is not subject to massive changes either, like LP little a, lipoprotein little a, is something that is genetically driven in general. This is not something that's going to change dramatically. So even some of this stuff, checking one time to then see your cardiovascular disease potential, atherogenic potential, and risk down the line, like, this is absolutely worth fleshing out as early as possible, in my opinion. So you can check it out. We have the most cost-efficient labs, the most elaborate labs, the highest sensitivity of labs as well, and the most expert individuals who can then assess and interpret this stuff for you and help educate you on your current health status and the path forward for optimization and dialing things in from a lifestyle, sleep hygiene, and potentially pharmacology perspective. So you can check it out, link in description below. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.